Well, we're going to start right on time. We appreciate so many of you coming out here. As you can imagine, the disbelief by the entire family is immense. And as I've told many, you can say what you want about Big Frank, but no one will doubt for a moment that he was authentic. He had a mold all to himself. He did things and acted in ways that are different. And this wake tonight was basically his idea. He wanted nobody waiting in line, nobody standing in the cold. He wanted an unconventional wake. And as I visited with him over the years, as you know, what Big Frank liked, he liked lots of laughter and lots of joys of tears. And so that's what we're going to try to recreate here tonight, is a spirit of atmosphere that Big Frank, and those of you who have ever given a talk, know that the one guy you want in the crowd on the front row was Big Frank. Because even Father's jokes weren't very good. He would laugh so loud and say, "Oh, that was so funny." So he always wanted Big Frank in the front. And as you know, Big Frank refused to give in to a lifestyle the world was trying to put on him. Big Frank lived the life that he wanted to live, not the way the world told him he should live. As an example, the world told Big Frank, "You're a city boy. You can't make it farming in Kimball, Minnesota. You just don't do that." Big Frank said differently. When he went to start having children, now it took some persuasion with Grandma Frosty, but mathematically, there is no way you could have 9 boys in a row. But Big Frank did it. And I will tell you, he did it a little deceivingly because he kept giving Grandma Frosty just that little kernel of hope. This could be your daughter. And I will tell you a true story. They had been trying for a daughter for now 20 years, right? And initially they picked out the name of Sue. By the time they got to Danny being born, she goes to Big Frank, "I'm kind of sick of that name. We should think of something different." When he came to Kimball, and he started buying up this ground that was full of trees and full of hills and water that most farmers said, "You can't make a living on that kind of ground." That's what the world kept telling him, and Big Frank said, "I can and I will." And probably most importantly, this is probably, bear with me if I break up just a little bit, but most importantly, Big Frank knew how to raise a family. The world says, when you raise 9 sons and they get married, there is no way those 9 sons will be married forever to those first wives. Big Frank said differently. He said, you raise a family right, you treat them with the right values, marriages can last and should last forever. You know, Danny wrote just a beautiful obituary about Big Frank. And there's a line in there to me that was incredibly special. It said, to meet Big Frank was to remember Big Frank. Now we're going to hear a few stories from the family, but first, just a little advice from Grandma Frosty and kind of what's been going on with her. I just want to share a story with you about Big Frank. Big Frank knew what to do and when to do it. He just had a knack. And I just want to share something with you just to show you the good example he left for our family. About 2 years ago, as you know, our family meets every morning at the morning meeting. About 2 years ago, Big Frank sat down with me and said, Donnie, I'm not going to be attending the morning meetings anymore. And I was shocked. Big Frank will love the farm. He doesn't miss. He said, I have a higher calling. Grandma Frosty needs me. And from that time forward, he had a routine, take care of Grandma Frosty. He would, in his state, set his alarm, get Grandma Frosty up, prepare her breakfast, set her down, make sure she ate her breakfast, and then he would go back to rest. He would then get her back up, he'd get back up, and they'd make their routine, paying the checks, making the deposits, doing all those good things, riding around with him, and he made sure she had a good lunch. And then lastly, every night, he tucked her in and kissed her goodnight. Big Frank knew what he was doing. Now some stories that will hopefully bring a little more laughter. First, we're going to hear from the Franks. Frank the Third and Frank the Fourth. There's something about sharing the same name with your father that has just a little special presence. And let's just hear a little story they may have with regarding to be one of those famous Franks.
I'm not sure, but I think they had this planned out that I wouldn't be able to stand up here and talk very long. So they had it planned for today. But I think Big Frank kind of knew what was happening. He was in the hospital, I know, Friday and Saturday. Called him up Saturday morning and told him, I said, yeah, everything's going with my knee replacement, but you're not here. And I said, went to the morning meeting. Boys said, we can't have two Franks gone from the morning meeting. And he goes, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. He said, I'll be home Sunday. And sure enough, he did his best to get out of the hospital so he could be home Sunday. Little did I know that would be the last time I got to visit with him. But that's all I got to say tonight. And I'll give it to another Frank.
So, as you know, I'm Frank the Third's son and Big Frank's grandson, and Frank Sr.'s great-grandson, and we'll just keep going. I'm the dad of Frank the Fifth, and as you all know, my name is Sam, and my name is Frank the Fourth. I should have wrote it down, I'm sorry. But I'm the oldest grandson of the family, and one of the benefits of being one of Big Frank's older grandchildren is naturally you just got to spend more time with him. And I know a lot of the older grandchildren didn't even call him by Big Frank. We actually called him by Big F. You know, Big Frank, he wasn't big enough to be Big Frank. We just gave him Big F. And I got to be pretty close with Big Frank. I farmed with him every day of my life. I lived next to him every day of my life. And I shared the same name as him every day of my life. So we had a connection. But what you didn't know is I was his personal barber. Now I know what you're thinking, and it's okay, because I thought it too, and Grandma Frosty bluntly told it to him. Why do you need a personal barber when you don't have any hair? But I remember the first time he asked me to cut his hair. I was driving a four-wheeler down a dirt road, and I look ahead, and I see a Chevy pickup truck driving about 10 miles per hour towards me. As I got closer, an arm came out of the side of the window. Now, this was pre-cell phone, so usually when you saw an arm come out of the window, that's Big Frank trying to get what they call today signal. He was literally trying to reach out and touch someone. He was trying to get a hold of someone. So I stopped, and he said, I really need a haircut tonight. Would you be willing to give me one? I thought to myself, I'm 22 years old. This is a Friday night. How do you know I don't have a hot date to get to? Well, obviously he knew I didn't, so I said, my book is open. I'll come over. About 8:30, 9 o'clock that night, I go in. Big Frank's sitting in his chair next to Grandma Frosty, and they're watching TV. Now, they're watching Fox News, and I know this for a fact, because it was so loud I could actually hear it in the garage before I got into the house. I set up a chair in his kitchen, a low barber chair, and he sat down, and I started cutting his hair. And I'm a little nervous. I really hadn't done this. And I'm pretty sure I had a cattle clippers and a curry comb as tools to do it. So as I'm cutting it, I said, Big Frank, why the haircut tonight? What's the big occasion? And his eyes lit up. He said, I'm glad you asked. He said, this Tuesday, I'm heading down to the state capitol to talk to legislation on getting my mental health program together and try and get funding for it. I thought, that's a big deal. Don't you want to look nice for it? Why don't you go get yourself a good haircut and I'll do your bad haircut in, 3 weeks. And he said, Rot? That's what I go by back home is Rot. He said, Rot, do you know what the difference between a good haircut and a bad haircut is? And right away I thought, why these questions? I don't know math. This is probably a math question. So I answered him. I said, no, Big Frank, what's the difference between a good haircut and a bad haircut? He said, about 3 days. That made me feel pretty good. I got done cutting his hair, and he was so excited to sweep up all the clippings and see how much hair there was. In fact, he tried to convince me there's a lot of hair, but I just smiled and said, I see some hair on the ground. Well then, the haircut turned out pretty good. In fact, it was so good, I even offered Grandma Frosty a haircut that night, but she politely declined. But he is very appreciative of this haircut. He said, I feel bad taking time away out of your life to do this for me. He said, let me repay you. So he repaid me the only way Big Frank knew how. It was either an ice cream cone, a piece of pie from a pie one of the daughter-in-laws had made him, or my personal favorite, a chunk of steak that they couldn't quite finish at supper, that he insisted I eat because if he reheated it as a leftover, it would have wrecked the whole piece of meat. From that day on, every 3 weeks, he'd either stop me on the road or he'd give me a call. He'd say, Rod, when you get a chance, can you give me a haircut? This went on for over 20 years. At least 352 haircuts, but who's counting? Numerous stories that cannot be counted. And every 3 weeks, I'd drive over, I would get a stool, and I would cut his hair, up until his very last haircut, just a couple weeks ago. And I miss those haircuts, Big F.
Well said, and I tell you what was so unique about Big Frank was his ability to bridge across to people, whether they were the most dominant people in the world to the most ordinary, common, hardworking, blue-collar people in the world. And I just want to share something with you here in between as Mike makes his way to the stage. Mike's next. As we were speaking, I just got, truth as I am, a video, and we aren't going to show it because I didn't click on it, but a video from a U.S. Congresswoman, Michelle Fischbach, in memory of Big Frank. She did a special tribute video to him. So he was able to bridge all his gaps. Mike, let's hear a story from you.
Well, I'm not really good in front of people unless I'm in my semi slowing you down. So I'm telling you, but Bob said, Dad would like this. He said, go ahead, do it. Who cares? So I was sitting in line, like I always do in that semi. I jotted down these 9 quotes or phrases in Big Frank, like the number 9, that kind of touched me through the course of his life. Number 1, and I'm glad there's video to prove some of this. If you try enough, you can get any girl. Then I like this quote because, Mom, he had to prove it. Mom was almost in a convent, and he got her out of there. Then this one, I actually got to use. I wasn't having any luck in Minnesota with women. And I thought, South Dakota, it's easier out there. I went out there. And gall darn it, it took me 4 years of begging to get Teresa to say yes. So I'm telling Skylar, you know, he's trying the same thing. He's on 4 years too begging. So that one kind of I liked. Okay, this number 2. A young man in Minneapolis can go out in Kimball, Minnesota to farm. And this one touched me because, you know, Orlo, he was a nerd, mathematic, Minneapolis guy, you know, and I mean, on paper, nothing about him was farming. I mean, he shouldn't even thought about this. But yet, he didn't care, he went with his heart. And he came out there, and you know, he wasn't good at it the first couple of years. In fact, he was terrible. But eventually, he did. He learned how to drive a tractor and feed a cow. So I like how his heart was set, and he just kept driving for that. Okay, this number 3. The number 3 one is, okay, if you buy lots of land, your family becomes larger and more closely knitted. Now this one, he was buying land, and I mean, I was thinking, Dad, how did you know you had enough boys to help with this land? And he said, you know what? If they're girls, I'll make them work the same. So, you know, he wasn't that chauvinistic that you guys think. Oh, this number 4. Now this number 4 was in the video there. If you have 9 boys, you get the best and cheapest labor. I mean, like this is all true. I was hoping to get $20 at the end of the month, you know, and sometimes he would forget. And he worked me to death, but then it was a good excuse why he didn't have any dating in high school, no money, and working all the time. I mean, that's a good excuse, so. But boy, we worked. All of them. Okay, number 5 was kind of a fun one. Black Angus is the best tasting beef. Now these were fun taste tests. He wanted the best tasting beef. And so he would cut up Hereford with toothpicks, Holstein, and mix them up, and taste test after taste test, you know. And finally he got everyone to say Black Angus was the best. So then he went with it. All right, this number 6. The grandchildren don't know about number 6, but my brothers know number 6 well. Picking rock by hand is more efficient than an air-conditioned bobcat. That was this. I mean, this slogan wasn't only for this, the sad part. It was for trimming a fence. It's quicker and better than a gator spraying. I mean, then we couldn't believe it, you know. And this one I scratched my head to this day. What was he proving to make us do all this extra work for nothing? Was it to get us smarter? Was it, you know, I just didn't understand this aspect of them. So, but the grandkids now, it's all automatic. The brothers took care of that, what leads to number 7. Orlo's motto was, I'm right until you prove me wrong. He loved to be right. I'm glad to talk here because right now he can't prove me wrong, so I'm going to speak freely about it. So my older brothers, thank goodness, caught on to number 6 where we were doing all this work for nothing. They started to prove them wrong finally. So then we got automated and, you know, it was so much better, you know, but I think he was trying to just get us tougher. Okay, this number 8. I was with the hospital with my boy. Luckily, I went in there, and all afternoon I spent with him in his last days here. I was with Brandon, and I heard a little bit here and there that he said he was really the first one to invent the computer. Okay, now this is true. So then Brandon and I there, and with the nurses, and then he started explaining it. You know, I invented the computer here, and when he was in college there. And he explained to the nurses, and they just you think you need more medicine, you know. But Brandon was like, geez, you know, it really might work. And then Brandon would nudge me. He said, just think if you went after that instead of the farming a little bit. I said, I know. And number 9 here. And everyone knows number 9. Dad was hard-nosed German. Sometimes he was hard to live with, you know, and Frosty is a saint for living with me for almost 70 years. And this goes out to Kat here. I mean, they were so good together all the time and everything. And Dad knew that you were just so perfect too. So, I mean, then put that aside. I'm kind of was the out guy looking in at the farm, trucking. And every weekend I went out there to have some, lunch with Dad. And he said every time I was trying to sneak, look through group chat to get gossip. But he was like, I don't want to die. And I said, well, everyone has to. He said, if you only knew how much fun I have out here rolling around in this truck looking at those guys working. And he truly, I don't even know I saw it from the outside. And he truly loved it so much, watching from the brothers, the great, all of them. So, I just couldn't believe how much he loved that. And the thing is, the sad part of this, he really didn't want to die. He is loving this so much. Now, here's where I'm going to give credit to my brothers, the grandkids, and the great-grandkids. They made an atmosphere for their dad here, or grandpa, great-grandpa, so naturally. It was so, what's the word I'm trying to look for, where it was just, he was involved with everything. They gave him, here's a new pickup, because then they rotated pickups, and so much part of this farm together with them. They were farming it was unbelievable how freedom he had with the farm yet. Credit card, get everyone, for keeks and everything that was just, he was so a big part of it. Bob would keep him busy, for getting parts. He stayed a part of that farm right to the end. And it was unbelievable how well they did that with him. And I got to mention too, Sam with those tractors, and his, I got to call out on Sam, the grandson here, because the brothers, we were tired. We weren't interested. We were so glad that Sam was, because we were tired to fool with that. But he did like those darn tractors and fixing up all that stuff. So he got joy from the end of that too. So, it was joy to the end with this man right here. I guarantee it. Then when I was over at Grandma Frosty's the other night, he's telling me what happened and everything. And he said, I tried to get his cell phone, but he was on it. And I said, well, what were you going to do then? You don't know how to use it. Oh, I was going to give it to someone. And I'm like, but fragile Grandma Frosty had that walker. If you know how our farm is set out, she walked with that walker up crushed rock to find someone to save Dad. And I couldn't believe it. She just kept going. And she said, I was racing, and I said, Mom, you go like 1.2 miles, about a half miles an hour. What were you were, but she tried so hard to save Dad with that walker going up the hill. So if that's not almost 70 years of true love, I really don't know what is. You know what I mean? So in close here, he's a legend. In my mind, he had a legacy, a family legacy that he wants to go on to prosper from generation to generation. And the way he did it wasn't he was honest. He worked hard. He didn't give up. His the whole thing, but he did it with that, it's hard to describe, that, smile, fun, laughter, charming. I mean, any stranger could see it. It was a special gift he had that just, it was unbelievable. So, and I really think for all you guys for giving your free time up here to come celebrate this with me tonight. I really do. So, thank you.
Now, if Travis would make his way to the stage, Travis has a few words to say, but as he's making his way, I'll just share a quick story with you. When Big Frank was in the hospital, every time Big Frank's somewhere, he tries to revolutionize where he's at. And he happened to have a lunch, and it wasn't so good. And he said, this lunch is not very good. And he's telling the nurse, he said, you could fix this up real quickly with just a few adjustments, and this lunch would almost be edible. And then there was some pause, and he said, would you mind having the chef come up here? I'd like to visit with her. And I am sitting here saying, Dad, the chef's not going to come up, take pointers from a guy who's got an IV in him on how to make dinner better. But guess what? Big Frank got the chef up in his bedroom, up in the office. And by God, he said the next meal was edible. With that, Travis.
So I'm one of the younger grandsons. He was always Big Frank to me. I didn't quite hit the Big F stage. And thinking back about him, I have two distinct childhood thoughts that really stuck out to me. And even as a child, I knew these things. The first was he was a good grandpa. He really was. And the second, he was a bad fisherman. And it was all really, both of these points were really brought home to me one summer when he took it upon himself to teach me and my brother how to fish. So first we tried the pontoon, no fish. Then we tried the dock, no fish. We tried the river, no fish. And instead of blaming the fishermen in typical Big Frank fashion, he blamed the equipment we had. So Big Frank went through for us and found an old boat with an old trolling motor, and he took us out on the lake with it. He said, this is how you guys are going to catch fish. We have the proper equipment, we're ready. So we got the motor out, we got halfway out in the middle of Scott Lake, and the motor quit. But did he give up? No. We had two paddles in that boat with us, and he paddled us across Scott Lake, back and forth, with the hopes we would catch something with our trolling lines. We did not. And it shows you what a good grandpa he was. It was the only time I'd ever seen him sweat. The only time. The only time after that was after he had his second helping of dessert, after his second helping of prime rib, after his third helping of shrimp. That's the effort he put into us to try and catch that fish. And as I grew up, I started to see a different side of him as well. As I became an adult and I started traveling through the Dakotas in Montana, no matter where I went, people knew Big Frank. It didn't matter if I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, miles from the nearest town. Frank had been there before me, and they remembered him. It's amazing how many people knew he spoke Russian. I don't even know if he spoke Russian, but they did. And the thing that started to stand out with all of these people, they all had one thing that always was in common. Whenever they mentioned Big Frank's name, they always smiled. And it didn't matter if it was the worker behind the Casey's counter or a waitress in the middle of nowhere at a steakhouse. They remembered him and they smiled. And looking back at my own life then, I realized whenever Big Frank was in somebody's day, that person's day was just a little bit better. And that's when I kind of realized he wasn't just a good grandpa, but he was actually a great man. And that's something that I'd like to bring into my life. So I guess if everyone could maybe just bow their heads and say a quick prayer for a good man, or for a good grandpa, a great man. And if we all pray hard enough, Maybe you'll actually catch a fish in heaven. Thank you.
Next we'll have Tim. He is Travis's father, and Tim travels far and wide to do lots of talks. They try to get information out, but he ends up being a stand-up comedian more than he is an information person. Tim.
My name is Tim, but there's 100 of us here, and you'll never remember that, so you can just call me number 8. Because I'm the 8th son of the family, and my wife Robin and I supplied 7 of those 32 grandchildren for Big Frank and Grandma Frosty. And it was interesting because, 7 kids is a lot, and Big Frank and I would travel together, and some people would ask Big Frank, they'd say, hey, how many kids? He called me Bert, by the way. That was my nickname, Bert. How many kids does Tim have? And Big Frank wouldn't say, oh, he has 7. Big Frank would say, he has 2 less than me. He was very competitive. He was. And I remember when we had our 7th child, when Ava was born, and I called him up and I said, oh man, Big Frank, we had our number 7th. Boy, these kids are a lot of work. He goes, what do you mean? You're barely getting started. When Mom and I had 7 kids, that was the easy time. It only got difficult after number 7. And then I thought, wait a minute. I came after number 7. And then I figured it out. I figured out why is because Danny, the youngest, was a really bad kid. Yeah. And one thing Big Frank and I, we all have a little bit of Big Frank in us, some more than others. One thing he and I had in common was, boy, we love our families and we like to talk about them. And Big Frank had that unique capability of being able to work with each and every grandkid and have their own special relationship with that grandkid. And I'm going to talk about how he was with our family and our 7 kids. And I got to start with my wife, Robin. Robbie was her nickname, or MF from Big Frank. Only I know what MF stands for. But Robbie came up here from Texas to meet Big Frank when she's 22 years old. And she was at the farm for a whole week. And when she left that farm, Big Frank came over to me and he said, Bert, that Robbie's a good one. She comes from good stock. He always used cattle terms to bring into that. I don't know. So for those of you that don't know it, coming from good stock means that she was raised by good parents. And what was unique about that is 35 years later, Robin's mom and dad, Sherman and Judy, move up to Kimball, Minnesota. In the last 10 years of Big Frank's life, Sherman was one of his best friends. And it was really neat for him because he needed a friend, but even more so, he was really happy because he was right 35 years ago that she came from good stock. And then my 7 kids are all here. Luke is my oldest. Just raise your hand. I was going to have you come up here. But Luke and Samantha, his wife, are here from New York. I picked them up this morning. Luke flew in. Luke and Big Frank had one thing in common. They're both master mathematicians. But I figured out mathematics, genetics must skip a generation because he got it, I didn't, and he did. And when I picked up Luke at the airport this morning, it was very touching. He got in the truck with me, and he shook my hand, and he looked at me, and he said, Dad, do you think Big Frank's in heaven? And I said, yeah, Luke. He said, Dad, do you think Big Frank's looking over God's shoulder, telling him how to do things? And I said, yes, Luke, he is. My second oldest son is Travis, who you just heard. His wife, Brady, was here. They have a little kid named Liam. Can anybody guess what Liam's middle name is? Frank, how'd you know? By the way, for those of you that don't know the family very well, if you can't remember our names, just call us Frank. You're bound to be right, you know. It's the highest percentage chance. My third oldest child is Andy. Where are you, Andy? And her wife, Sam. There's Andy. Sam, they have 2 young kids. This was on Big Frank's desk. It's called the Andy jar. It's all the change that he puts in from when he buys stuff in cash, and he puts the change in the Andy jar. And the reason why he does that is when it gets full, he puts a cap on it, and he always brings it over to Andy's house. And you'd be surprised, all these nickels in here, how much money that adds up to. It's quite a bit. And he always brought it over to Andy's house, and although lately the Andy jar wasn't filling as quick as it used to be, and the reason is Dad got a credit card and he realized you could get cash back when you used it. So he paid less in cash and more in credit cards. So the Andy jar, this was sitting on his desk. Andy wasn't quite full. They were giving 2% back this month. But anyway, I asked Dad once, why do you give this jar to Andy? I mean, he always did something for a reason. He always had a specific reason for doing something. And he goes, Bert, I give it to Andy because she's a stay-at-home mother. And you know, as a stay-at-home mother, you don't earn any money. And some days you take care of these kids and you think, what have I accomplished today? And think, I didn't even make a nickel. And he said, Bert, I give this to Andy because I want her to know when she takes care of these kids at home, she's worth much more than a nickel. My 4th oldest kid that's here is Peyton. Where's Peyton? Peyton here. Peyton and his new wife, Harley, they just got married in October. Big Frank didn't make the wedding. But like I said, Big Frank had a unique bond with each one of the grandkids. And his bond with Pate was women. Big Frank was very observant. He would drive around the farm, and when Pate was in high school, he'd always know Pate would take his dates around the farm. And he also figured out Pate would always have a different girl every week. And so Big Frank made Peyton a bet. I bet you can't beat me, Pete. I had 3 women on the same night in my Model A. I'll bet you can't do that. And the bet was on. And when I left to go to Pate's wedding, Big Frank couldn't make it. Big Frank said, tell Peyton, congratulations, good luck. And by the way, now that he's getting married, the bet's over. And I won. My 5th kid is Lucy Claire. Where are you, Lucy? Lucy was Big Frank's favorite family member in the summer between the hours of 12 and 1 o'clock. Now, why would she be the favorite then? Because that's when Mom and Dad would always go to Keek's restaurant, and Lucy was the waitress. And when Big Frank wanted butter, Lucy got the butter. And I think there was at least 10 waitresses that were here tonight. And let me tell you, you were all Big Frank's favorite when he was at Keek's. Thanks for taking care of him there. And then number 6 is my son Mark. Big Frank always liked, like Mike said, always liked to see the kids come to the farm. That was his pride and joy. And Mark would come to the farm from age 2 and on. And whenever Big Frank would see Mark, he would drive up there and he would give Mark a silver dollar. And he was only like 3 or 4 years old. And Mark didn't know what it was worth or what it was, but he liked it. He was a Schiefelbein. And ever since then, Big Frank would go out, and if he saw Mark's eyes would perk up and look around and wait for Big Frank to go like this. And then he'd come up to that pickup, and he'd either have a silver dollar or an ice cream. Mark, you take care of those silver dollars. And my youngest is Ava, my little girl Ava. He always liked watching Ava at the farm as well. He liked Ava. We called them the littles. We had the middles and the littles. And he liked watching Ava play with those guys because she didn't have any girl cousins. It was all these mean boys. And he would go out and park and watch Ava get beat up and tackled and pushed on. And he'd say, Mommy, I don't think she'll come back tomorrow. And sure enough, Ava would be there. And Big Frank said to me, you don't have to worry about any boy hitting on her, or she'll punch him in the eye. And then there's me. And of all the boys, and if you talk to any of these brothers, I had the hardest job over all of them, by far. Don't let them try to tell you any different. Because when we started our bull auction to sell all these bulls, what we had to do is get bull customers from the West, Montana, South Dakota. And Big Frank, in his twilight of his career, is 60 and 70 years old. His job was to go out there and bring ranchers and get them to buy bulls. In order to do that, you had to be nice. You had to be honest. You had to be able to tell a story. You had to be able to laugh in order to convince them to come and buy a bull. Does Big Frank sound like he would be probably pretty good at doing that? Big Frank did that. And when he got too old to do that, guess who had to take his place? The only person that knows how I feel about taking Big Frank's place is a guy by the name of Mac Jones. Does anybody know who Mac Jones is? Probably not. He's the quarterback that took over for Tom Brady. That's what my job was. And I tried hard and I said, I'm going to be able to do this. I can do it as good as Big Frank. And I went with him for a while and we traveled around the country and we went to this place in Montana, big ranch, huge ranch. It was like Yellowstone. And the cowboy up there had a great big hat on. He goes, Frank, I like your genetics, but you're from Minnesota. We're in Montana. You have 40-acre pastures. I have 1,000-acre pastures. Do you think these bulls will come out here and breed my cattle? And Frank said, yes, they will. My bulls from Minnesota will come out there and they will breed those cattle and you'll have tons and tons of calves. And he said, well, how do you know that? How do I know that your bulls will breed my cows? And Big Frank looked him in the eye and said, because they're Catholic bulls. And I'm like, I can't do this. There's no way I can compete like that. And the guy bought bulls. Catholic bulls. So I told the boys, I told Donnie, I said, we got to do something different. I can't sell like Big Frank. So then we started buying ranchers' cattle and reselling them. So I'd buy them, sell them, or feed them out. So we'd buy several thousand head of cattle, which is several $1 million worth of cattle. And I did the buying and selling. Big Frank took care of all the check writing and cashing the checks. A match made in heaven, most of the time. Because we were a little different. I was one of the guys that wanted to be close to right, and Big Frank had to be exact. And one night he called me up. I bought 500 head of cattle, and he called me up and he said, Bert, we got a problem. We got a problem. You overpaid for those cattle. You gave them $7.54 too much. And I'm like, I'll have them buy me a hamburger. It's close enough. But the morning he died, I was in his office, and we went through several transactions of cattle. And he wasn't feeling the best. And I told him we did this and that. And he was trying to write them down. And I said, you got it? Can you balance all that out for me? And he goes, I think so. And then I left. And then Stacy is the one that came to find me. And we found him on the floor. And I brought Mom in the house. And I went to his desk. And there on the desk was every one of those numbers balanced to the T, to the penny. And he had it all done. Because the thing he liked to do every morning, he would get up out of his bed, walk to his office, pull out his front left drawer, and he made sure the checkbook was in there. Because he knew if the checkbook was in there, the boys still trusted him, and he didn't have Alzheimer's disease. But that was Big Frank, and Mom and I were trying to sum up how he was with the cattle producers, and some of you guys are on Facebook Live, and I had so many comments from so many cattle people across the whole country. It was just amazing. But one of them that came in the day he died, I read it to Mom, and Mom said, "Timmy, keep that one. This is what Frank was." And it read like this. "Hi, Tim. Nancy and I are so sorry for the loss of your father. Big Frank was truly a pioneer in the Angus breed. He not only built one of the most successful Angus herds in the nation, but helped the cattle producer market their calf crop every year. Big Frank's friendship, an example of faith and strong family values, put him in the most elite group of human life on earth. I'm thankful to have known Big Frank, and our thoughts are with your family." Thank you, John and Nancy, and thank all you guys for coming to celebrate one great man.
I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. There's no doubt Dad would be really proud and happy about this whole event, except for one thing. He probably didn't want to be the guest of honor of this particular event. As Timmy said, Timmy was number 8. I am the youngest, not the baby, Dad, the youngest. He'd always like to needle me. Mom would say it affectionately. Dad would say it very sarcastically. "Here is the baby of the family." And I'm like, okay. But I am number 9. And one thing that you knew about Dad on the farm was his love of numbers. And if he had it his way, he would just have us, not Frank, Rick, Bill, he would have it 1, 2, 3, 4. So thank you, Mom, for actually getting your way for once and having us actual names. I am convinced if Dad had it his way, he would take a cattle branding iron and put a 9 against my face, but luckily he did not know how to use one of those. But what he did do when I was a baby is he actually tagged me with a 9, so that wasn't very good anyway. No, he did not do that to me. And as Mike mentioned, our struggles and finding dates in high school, what he did do to me is give my brother Rick's corduroys to me as hand-me-downs, coupled with my dad's sense of humor. And if you knew anything about my dad's sense of humor, it was not a chick magnet. One thing that really set our farm apart that Dad focused in on is nicknames. You heard Bert talk, you heard Stud talk. Everybody had to have a nickname. And it was almost like a rite of if you were part of the farm, you got a nickname. If you married someone part of the farm, you got a nickname. And that didn't always go over well with all the wives, I can tell you. And those of you that are thinking of being part of the farm, meaning the middles, who are all the high school Schiefelbeins and services that are helping us, and the littles, remember, you don't get to pick your nickname. Nephew Frank wanted to be called Bull or T-Bone. Instead, he got Rot. So, and you might be thinking, geez, that Frank, he wasn't afraid of anybody or saying anything to anybody. And he was, he said what he wanted to say. He said it the way he wanted, and it was always with a sarcastic tone. And I was thinking, I was like going, is he afraid of anybody? And I'm thinking, there's one story where he was afraid of someone. I was recently got married, and I had a late supper, so I decided to drive to Mom's house to get something to eat. And no one hit that line. I just got done eating supper at my new bride's, and I had to go to Mom's to get something to eat. It sounded so much better 2 hours ago. But so I was driving up the driveway of the farm, and I looked to the left, and the office light's on. I'm like going, it's not calving season. Why in the world is the office light on? So I pulled up, and I was like, well, I better turn off the lights and save electricity. That's what Dad would want. And I poked my head in there, and there was Dad was watching TV. And I go to him, of course, with my own sarcastic, you do realize you have 2 TVs in your house? And he's like, Arj, Mommy hates when I watch Desperate Housewives, so. And couple other stories that really, in my mind, define the Schiefelbein sense of humor, which has been handed down from generation to generation. And Schiefelbein humor would be classified like, say, the now-time comedians. The first person who would censor them would be their wives. That's Schiefelbein humor. I took Dad into the hospital, it was about 6 months ago, after he had a self-prognosis that he had an infection. And I drew the short straw, so we got in about 4 or 5 o'clock in the ER, and they did the tests, and it turned out he did have an infection, and he was already taking antibiotics anyway, so he already knew. So we went up to, went up to his bedroom, and it was about 10:30, 11 o'clock, and he was settling in, and there's a couple nurses in there. And, I'm sure one nurse is ready to quit, another nurse is taking it, and he goes, I can't remember the last time I had 2 beautiful women in the room at the same time. All I could think of is you'd never say that in front of Mom, I bet. You could even watch Desperate Housewives rather than say that line. But we all know that he loved food. And so the last time I saw him was Monday afternoon. I just had a late lunch, so I wanted to go up to Mom's house to get something to eat. And I went in the house there, and I was like, Dad was sitting in the chair. And I was like, hey, so how you feeling? And he's like, as good as a 90-year-old could feel when he hasn't eaten for 4 days. And I'm like, and I look around, I'm smelling. I'm like, why do I smell bacon in the house? And he's like, and Mom's like, well, he did have some scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon. And I'm thinking, you just had a stomach ailment, and you're eating bacon? And he goes, Aj, have you ever tasted hospital food? The only thing that gets rid of that taste is bacon. And I know, a heart of hearts, that right now, he's got the best view of the place. He's up there in heaven. He's sitting next to my brother Fuzz and my nephew Butch. They're all on 3 old tractors that don't need to be pulled to get started. They just start on their own. And he's saying, you know what? Schiefelbein humor lives on. And it's something I personally will never forget and always appreciate, is that humor and that wit he had. And I'm thankful today that you can tell that he passed it on to another generation. Thank you.
Last thing I'm just going to leave you with, and I think it's probably the best advice Big Frank has ever given me and given the family, given the country, and given the city. He said very simply, and I want you to digest this because I think it's just absolutely profound. He said, if this nation, or my apologies, he said, the only thing that can tear this nation apart, bring it down, or bring a family down, is from fighting from within. If you stick together, both as a country and a family, the opportunities are boundless. Thank you all for being here tonight.